Welcome back to Chess Dog, and today we've got a game where Alireza Firouzja maneuvers like a magician. I mean, what he pulls off in this game is like prestidigitation. Absolutely amazing. His opponent is Leinier Dominguez. This is a blitz game played at the Super United Blitz. 5 minutes for each side with a 2-second increment. Dominguez has white, Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. Dominguez begins with e4. E5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening. Firouzja plays the main line with a6, bishop to a4, knight f6, castles. But here he plays b5, bishop to b3, and now bishop to b7. More common, of course, is bishop to e7 with c3 and d6. But bishop to b7, known as the archangel defense, sometimes it's called the molar defense when black plays bishop to c5, which he will do here. Basically, it takes immediate aim at this e4 pawn. It's an aggressive posting, and he would love to open up that long diagonal and use that bishop to great effect. So Dominguez plays d3 immediately. He wants to make this e4 point as strong as possible to reduce the range of this bishop at b7. Bishop to c5, and now a4. Dominguez attacks this a6, b5 structure on the queen side, castles, and knight to c3. Continuing to put pressure on the b5 pawn, and Firouzja here plays knight to a5, opening up the bishop, aim at e4, but also threatening to trade off this bishop at b3. Firouzja would love to grab the two bishops here if possible. So Dominguez plays bishop to d5. Now, this is a rare choice, but it actually scores pretty well for white. Basically, he's trying to neutralize the bishop on b7 and leave this knight on a5 sort of stranded on the side of the board. Firouzja takes with the knight recaptures, and now he does have the two bishops, but he has to lose a tempo to re-centralize that knight from a5, goes back to c6, and now bishop to e3. Firouzja does not want to take on e3. It's an acceptable move. There's nothing wrong with it, but he wants to keep pieces on the board and plays that bishop back to d6. It's an awkward square, but it helps over-defend e5, and he says this bishop is going to come out later. Come out later to do some fancy stuff. Dominguez continues with c4, gaining space on the queen side. Pawn takes, and now a5. So Firouzja has some dark squared weaknesses that he may be able to take advantage of in the center and the queen side, but Dominguez has a really nice space advantage, and that advantage grows after his next move, c5. And the bishop is forced back to e7. And I have to say, looking at black's position, I think Firouzja should be a little uncomfortable here. Dominguez has a lot of space and fairly easy play for his pieces, and black's pieces are going to have a hard time maneuvering here, but that's when the magic comes in. So watch and see how Firouzja handles this. Queen to c2, helping to support this pawn. Rook to e8, rook f to d1. Placing the rook opposite the queen, always a good idea. H6, keeping a piece out of g5. Rook to d2. He plans to double on the d file and put it even more pressure on black's position. But now the maneuvering begins from Firouzja. He takes the bishop and puts it on f8. A common idea in these structures. Rook a to d1. The space and pressure continue. Rook to e6. You see, Firouzja is basically only playing on his back three ranks. So it's not a lot of room, but he's still getting his pieces to the squares he wants to. H3, rook to b8. He wants to attack this b2 pawn. When this bishop at b7 moves out of the way, he will. Queen to c3. Dominguez puts pressure on a5 and e5. The bishop moves out of the way of the rook. And now rook to d3, clearing the way for the knight at f3 to move to d2 and then c4, to help the queen attacking the e5 and a5 pawns. So Firouzja doesn't want him to do that. He doesn't want to just let him maneuver his pieces to their ideal squares. So he plays knight to b4. And this is sort of an interrupting move. It disturbs the knight at d5 and keeps Dominguez from following through with his maneuver. Knight takes b4, a b4, hits the queen. The queen moves to c4. Bishop to c6, hits the a4 pawn, and b3 helps defend that pawn. But now this pawn on e4 no longer has the d3 pawn defending it, so there's a little more pressure on that pawn. Queen to f6. Now that this pawn is a little bit softer, the idea is the queen is going to go to g6, and along with the bishop at c6, is going to put a double attack or two-piece attack on that pawn at e4. So knight to d2. Dominguez sees the pressures coming, so he over-defends. Queen to g6, and now f3. So now e4 is firmly defended, but there are light squared weaknesses created on the king side in order to defend that pawn. King to h8. Basically, he wants to play f5, but he doesn't want this rook at e6 to be pinned by the queen. So he moves the king out of the way before that happens. Bishop to f2, bishop to e7, knight to f1, and f5. And it really amazes me how effectively Firouzja has been able to maneuver with so little space. And now he's beginning to get real counterplay, just maneuvering on 3 ranks. Amazing. Knight to g3, pawn takes, knight e4. So this knight on e4 is a very strong piece for white. But again, there are these 2 bishops. And Firouzja can take it if he wants to at a later point. The rook goes to f8. And amazing. Firouzja has gotten pretty much everything he wanted out of this position. Now, the game is marred a little bit by a double blunder that takes place right here. Dominguez plays king to h2, and that is a blunder. Firouzja could have just taken on e4. Remember, this is a blitz game, and after takes, the bishop at f2 would fall. But after Dominguez blunder, then Firouzja makes a mistake. He plays bishop to g5. So he's thinking strategically, not tactically. He would love for this knight to give itself up for this bishop and just get that off the board, and then this bishop would even grow in strength. So he was thinking strategically. And if white doesn't take the bishop can go to f4 and take advantage of these dark squares. So that happens sometimes. You think strategically and miss tactics. Bishop to g3, come to this square, bishop to f4. He doesn't mind trading off dark squared bishops so he can take advantage of these holes. Bishop f4. ef4, rook to d4 to help defend the knight, rook f to e8. So black has 4 pieces aimed at e4 to capture the knight and win the pawn that recaptures it. So Dominguez takes on b4. So I'm going to get that pawn, even though you're going to get a central pawn, takes, and he takes this and gets the central pawn. Now, in this position, black can generate some pressure against white's king, and white has to defend accurately. And he plays queen to g3 check. And immediately, Dominguez makes a mistake, but it's a really easy mistake to make. I mean, very hard to see this. He plays the move king to h1, which seems like a natural move. It seems like the move you would play because you don't want to play king to g1 because now f3 can come and there's a pin on the g-pawn. But as it turns out, this is the way white saves the position because after queen to d2, if rook takes e4, then queen to f2, and the king at g1 supports the queen at f2. That's the difference. When the king is at h1, it can't support that queen. And if black just takes on g2, then after queen to d3, offering the exchange of queens, this is 0.00 in the computers. It's an equal endgame. But after king to h1, it doesn't work. Because now f3 is still played. You can't take the pawn because if the black queen takes it, it would double attack the king and the rook. And now queen to d2, the same line, but now rook to e4 is crushing because white can't play the queen to f2 because the king would not support it. And in this position, if the rook goes here, the queen cannot take it because black would mate on g2. And believe it or not, Firouzja is completely winning. Rook to g1 to defend the mate with the rook. And now rook to e2, also f2, hitting this rook also wins after rook f1, rook e1, and that would be the end of it. Just, obviously, you just queen. Rook to e2 attacks the queen as well as the g2 pawn. Queen to d5 to try to defend from this diagonal backwards. But then f2 hits the rook, rook f1, rook to e1. But now the queen can go to c4. So for the moment, it looks like white might be able to hold on. But then after queen to e3, the game was over. And the reason the game ended here is because, let's say, there's nothing white can do, basically. He's locked in. So let's just say he plays a5, trying to advance his pawn to the queening square. Then rook f1 check, queen f1, and then queen to e1. And the king cannot get over to defend the queen and just taken. That would be the end of the game. How Firouzja was able to maneuver with so little space into such an amazing attacking position is absolutely amazing to me. And even after going over this great game, there is still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you want to see is this sacrificial masterpiece from Firouzja. Check it out and see some really mind-blowing chess.